Hello, everyone. My name is Rich Martin, Director of Technical Marketing at Itential, and welcome to our webinar today on how to publish and expose network automations as a service to accelerate adoption. Let's jump right into what this demo will look like. This is interesting because normally a lot of our demonstrations revolve around building a demo. In this case, I do want to show you 4 different demos, but the focus of this isn't really building them, although we will review them quickly so you know all the components and essentially what they do. But really the focus on this is how to publish these workflows and maybe the different ways that you are looking at publishing workflows for self-service. And really, I want you to see from the Itential product perspective, I want to highlight all the features that we have because in the world of network automation, especially if you come from scripts or Ansible playbooks or Terraform or whatever you're using to kind of do like CLI based or command prompt based automations, publishing those automations in a safe, secure way, interacting with your existing LDAP, providing encryption, API endpoints, all of those things don't come for free. They actually have to be provided either by some other platform or perhaps custom written. And so with the Itential platform, not only do we want to make it easy to build and create and share these automations, but also to expose them and publish them so that you can increase the adoption of these network automations. Because that's one of the things we found is as we help customers build automation and then expose them in different ways through different methods of self-service, they see the utilization increase of those services. And so today what we want to talk about is we're going to be in the Itential platform, obviously, but I'm going to show you the different workflows. And then we're going to publish them, and we'll spend a lot of time in Operations Manager where we publish the automations, and also we are there for job control as well. And so one of the automations we'll look at is we'll review and publish an automation workflow by use for the networking team. So this could be self-service. In a lot of cases, it's maybe the first step of self-service is from the networking team's perspective. I want to build a bunch of great automations that maybe help make my job easier by automating repetitive tasks that may be part of my day-to-day. And wouldn't it be great to increase adoption if I could publish this self-service to other people on my team? So we'll review the an automation that does a find MAC address across a different set of network devices, and then show you how to publish that for use by your networking team. The next one we'll do is we'll review a publish a workflow to use on a schedule. So think in terms of compliance audits or anything else that might need to be run on a schedule. I'll show you what that automation looks like and then how we publish that. We also will take a look at reviewing and publish a workflow for perhaps integration into a DevOps team's pipeline through an API interface. So I'll show you how to do that. In this case, it could be like a unit test, right? Maybe they're asking as part of their pipeline process, can you create a series of unit or functional tests? We provide variables to you, and then you tell us, you give us a response back whether it passes or fails. So I'll show you an example of that. And then finally, we'll review and publish a workflow so that you can create perhaps an end-to-end service. For now, we're going to simplify it, creating a new interface, but obviously a new service or something maybe for an application could be published in ServiceNow, and we'll show you how we easily enable that as well. And of course, we'll spend most of our time in Operations Manager for access control, publishing, data validation, and job auditing. All of those things that, like I said earlier, don't come for free when you're building it. You're building your own automations based off of existing kind of command line tools. So now let me share my screen, and we can get started. Okay, so we're starting off now in the automation platform. And the first place I want to go is I want to go into Automation Studio because I want to show you the workflows that we're working on. And so I've pre-created these workflows. So under workflows here on the left-hand side, under this folder here, my first workflow we're going to take a look at is called Find MAC Address. So when I click that will load it into our canvas, and this is where we can start to build this. So I've built this already, and I want to walk you through some of the features and functions of it, and then I'll show you how to publish it. So I know in the past, at previous webinars, I've probably built this step by step. but let's go through it just to see it in action. The first step here is what we call a transformation. This is called a JSON schema transformation, but really transformations on our platform are all about taking data coming in from a source, manipulating that data, or maybe extracting some of that data. And that data is coming in as a JSON object. So it makes it easy to take functions and features in a visual workflow canvas. And we've got webinars that focus purely on our transformation capabilities, but we want to extract some of that data out. So in this case, since we're going to find a MAC address across a series of routers, we want to query the user through a form to enter a MAC address. And so that's where the data is coming in from. So this transformation is going to extract the MAC address variable out of that data that is input by the user. So the next step in the automation here is a task called get device group by name. So we're using an internal feature here in Configuration Manager. And I'll show you that to you right now. So in Configuration Manager, this is another part of our application on the platform. It allows us to do a lot of things. One of those things is to onboard devices into a federated inventory. And then once you have devices onboarded, you can create device groups. So I've created a device group for Cisco routers in Atlanta. So I have 2 devices in here, and I can add devices as needed. But I'm going to stay with the 2 for the sake of the demo. But I'm referencing in that task, in that workflow, that task is referencing that device group. So if I double click into this, I can see the variables that it requires. It's asking me, what's the group name? So that's Atlanta Cisco routers. And what this task will do, it'll retrieve the names of those devices in that group into an array. So I have a list essentially of all the devices. So as I add a new device into there, maybe the 3rd Cisco iOS router in Atlanta, I can add it to that group. And the device group, this API call into that will then show the 3rd one instead of the 2. So it makes it easy to expand that. So I can define all of the routers that I want to run this particular workflow across by adding them to that device group. So the next step is a query. All I really want to do is I want to query out, in this case, the devices in that response from this task call. So this is gonna give me a lot of data in a JSON object. This query says, give me the device list. That's really what I'm interested in. I need that list. And then we've got a little logic here. This is a for each loop. So I'm passing the list of devices, which I assume are going to be multiple. In this case, it'll be 2. And I want to take them one at a time. So for each one of those devices in that list, I'm going to run a series of commands down here. So this flow is a loop command. So it tells me loop through that list of devices. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to run a command template. So this command template, what it does is it executes a command. We'll take a look at a command template a little bit later in another workflow, but it allows you to define a list of CLI commands, in this case on a Cisco device, and then parse the output for a pass or fail condition. So all I'm doing here, in this case, it could be like you could do maybe, if I had a switch, I could do something like a show MAC address table. In this case, I'm just doing a show ARP because I want to get some MAC addresses, and this is a router, not a switch. So I just needed some data to fill here. So I'm executing that command in the CLI, and then the command template parses it out to determine if that particular MAC address that's going to be input from our user through a form matches. And if so, it's going to query that result, evaluate it to determine if that was a pass or fail, meaning if it passes, it matches, that MAC address exists in that output, and then we'll view the data. So this task is a blue task, which will stop the automation and allow us to view the data just for the sake of demoing. If it doesn't match, then this evaluation won't take this positive path or the success path, and it won't show us anything because that MAC address didn't appear on that device. This could easily be an integration. We could be creating a new report. We could be outputting to email. We could be outputting to messaging service like Slack or Teams. You can define this with whatever you want for the sake of demo. We're just going to do this very simple view data task. But again, as you start building out these automations and what's available in your IT ecosystem, you can start to make these integrated into all of those tools that you have available. So that's the overview of this workflow. Now let's go over to Operations Manager. So Operations Manager is where we can both publish the workflow and take a look at jobs that are running. So in this case, remember the self-service use case here is Find MAC Address is a great little time-saving tool that I can automate and now expose and make available as a kind of a self-service entry to people on my networking team. People in the, in other teams wouldn't be interested in this. So this is kind of the focus, and is to allow the networking team to have access to this. So under automations, we have a list of published automations here. I want to create a new one. So I'm going to call this, I've got the name set up here so we can keep them consistent. Webinar publish, which is what this webinar is, find MAC address. So now I'm defining the name of the automation that'll appear. And the first thing it asks me for is, what is the workflow? So here the workflow is, these are a list of all the workflows that are on the system. So I can do a search here and say, find MAC address. Now I've defined that. And by default, since I've created this, my username and password have access to this. And in fact, the group that I belong to also has access to this. If I wanted to define additional groups that I wanted to provide access to this, I could do so here. So I could do different groups like sales engineer, operations. So I can, these are groups, and this is, we won't show this here, but this is part of the administration of the platform. And this is defined under admin essentials, where you can actually, we're integrating with our local LDAP so that these are groups already defined in our LDAP system. So we can provide read and write access to these to other groups here. I can save the changes. So again, none of that comes for free. Those things have to be provided by something when you want to publish an automation. So we can do that. So the next thing I can do here is I can define a trigger. So in our system, when we publish an automation, we have different ways of defining how we want to run an automation. So a manual trigger is what I want to use here. A manual trigger means you're going to run it from within the inside of the platform, from within the system. So if I select manual here, it's going to ask me for a form. So this is the form I referred to earlier in the workflow that I pre-created in the platform. In this case, it's also named Find MAC Address. If I click Find MAC Address, it's going to pull up the form that I've created for this. And the form is really just one field, MAC address. And I've already pre-populated it with a MAC address that exists. So if I save my changes here, now I've published this automation, but it's only available through a manual means here. That's the trigger I defined. So that means if I click on Run Trigger here, this is now asking me to fill out this form. And if I click Run Manually, I'm going to take the default here. It's going to process, and now it's going to take me to the job manager where I can watch the job execute, and I can see it executing in real time. Remember, it's pulling a group list. It's going to iterate over each one of these. It's going to run this command template to see if the MAC address exists out of the output of one of the CLI commands that I'm running. And then this query right here is looking for the results. So once this finishes, you'll see here in this view data, it's stopped at the view data. You see the highlight around this box. So that means, remember, view data is a manual task. So it's sitting there asking me to take a look at this task. So it stopped the whole workflow. It's just so we can take a look at it. So if I choose work this manual task, it's going to tell me, and I've defined this in the task in the workflow, that, hey, we found that MAC address on this particular router. iOS CSR AWS1. So if I click success, it's going to iterate again to the second one there. So it's running the command template. And then the second one, it didn't find it. And we can see that because I can take a look at this evaluation task. And then the iterations itself, you see task iteration. If I go to if I go to incoming, it's evaluating whether or not this was true or false. So if I look at these different iterations, whoops, I'm sorry, it was query. That's the one I want to look at. Variables, outgoing. Okay, so now I can take a look at the iterations. The first time it ran, there we go. The first time it ran, it was true. So I can take a look at this. This is a loop, so this is an iteration. So the first time it ran on the device, it came back true, meaning that MAC address existed, and therefore it took this path the first time and showed us that data. That was the view data. But the second time it ran, if I look at iteration 2, it came back false, which means that MAC address wasn't found there. So you can see this is a great way to publish an automation, make it self-serviceable, define the users you want to define to have access to it. And if you're already in a group with a bunch of other team members, network team members, they may be automation engineers or just network engineers that are part of a team that are building automations inside the platform, you can quickly create these nice, succinct tools to help automate these tasks and then publish them, and then they become available here. And again, I have access to all this because these were created in my group, but as you create new groups, you can pare these down. So only the automation. So the operations team could have a view that's just a bunch of maybe show commands, right? Find information on the network, show commands, things like that. So they can do some troubleshooting without actually making changes to the network. So those things are completely available as you build the automations and publish them. So that's kind of the first use case of self-service. So let's go to the second one. So in this demonstration, let's talk about publishing an automation as a scheduled event. One of the ones that always pops up is, since we have the ability to do config compliance, golden configuration templates, build golden configuration templates, and do config compliance, we also can automate all of those processes too. So this workflow essentially leverages a compliance task that I have, and I'll show you this, what it looks like in our compliance tree in a moment. But you get a tree ID. So this is a unique ID that references a config compliance, a golden configuration tree in our configuration manager app, part of our application, and then the initial version that we're using. So you have to have that data. So where does that data come from? If I hop over to config manager, I have this golden configuration for a group called core routers. You'll notice here that I've got a tree that's defined. So you start with generalized base layer of all routers, and I can start to define CLI commands. So for all routers, these commands should essentially, like this should not exist, IP HTTP server. These commands should exist. And if there's any problem as we do a compliance audit, this generates a severity error. I can now create another branch in the tree that inherits all of the command lines from the previous blue section here. And now I can start to add in more specific things. So US routers is regional. I can define a set of commands here as well that must exist on these routers. So things like SNMP servers, logging hosts, NTP servers, they're typical for that. And then you can create more branches as you go down with more and more specific configurations, even to something unique to a very particular network device. In this case, once you're done defining your golden configuration, you can associate devices that should be run with these, run using the configuration that's been defined and inherited through these branches. So in this case, I have 3 devices. You can see we won't run the compliance report, but we can run compliance reports manually from here. But we want to do this in an automated way, and we want to do it scheduled. So that's what this is about. So what this does is it references this golden configuration tree, and I can show you the tree ID here from the metadata. This is where the ID comes from and the version initial. So that's where that data comes from for this task. This is a built-in task that's part of our platform. So this allows you to automate these compliance audits. And then your next step could be, depending on what your environment's going to be. I've just created a task here that's just a placeholder, but you could generate a report per every device that doesn't meet that, the compliance test doesn't meet the compliance requirements and it failed or had warnings somehow. You could send that out as an email. You could, again, post it into Slack. There's a number of things you could do, or you could do all of the above. That's essentially just a placeholder for whatever you want to do with it. Or you can look at those compliance reports inside of the application within Configuration Manager itself. The point here is now, how do we take this and publish this so that it can be run? Again, this is something that we want to run scheduled. So once again, let's go over to Operations Manager, and we'll create a new automation to publish. And we will call this configuration compliance on router, audit on routers. Create. Workflow is going to be run config compliance audit a router. So that's the workflow we just looked at. On our triggers, we've got to create a new trigger now. And so I'm going to call this schedule. And so you'll see in our drop down here, our trigger type, we can select schedule. And this is exactly as you would think about, a schedule would be. What is the initial start date? Maybe we want to run this on Sundays, right? And we want to run it at, I don't know, that's 12:01 a.m. There we go. And then, of course, I want to repeat it. We'll repeat it every 7 days. We won't process missed runs. And because there's no input here, I don't have to put a form because it's just running that pre-existing task. I save changes. And now I have a schedule that's enabled, right? And it gives me all the details on when it's going to run. The cool thing about this too is, what if this also needed to be run manually occasionally? Instead of doing it every week, we want to actually run it manually. Do I need to go to the workflow and run it from there? No, that's really for testing purposes. What you really should be doing is creating another trigger, right? So I can do that. I can call this manual. Select the manual type trigger. There's no form on this that's associated because, again, we're not getting any input. And now I've created both a manual and a schedule trigger. The schedule trigger obviously will run on Sunday, running these audit reports, generating the reports that can be reviewed on Monday, perhaps. And then I have a manual way of running it as well. So if I click that, I can run manually, and it will run this manually, just like we did earlier. So now my team can also have a manual way of running these compliance reports. And that's what this is doing now. It's going through the compliance reports itself. And then, of course, it'll go through this task and finish off, giving us a list of all of the results of all three of those devices that were associated with that tree. And so if I wanted to now disable this so that I don't want to make it available, I can just click that. And now the schedule is the only one active. And this is great maybe for even testing. Maybe, instead of I just want to schedule this, but let me run a quick manual, make sure it works, and then disable it or even delete it if I don't want to use it. So that's our second use case. This would allow you, again, to schedule things. This is a little different in the sense that, this is not self-service necessarily, but it is something that is a repetitive task, and it's part of the operations manager, and it's a feature that allows you to publish, to schedule and repeat if necessary. And there's probably, if you think about it, there's probably a ton of tasks. So obviously, compliance audits is one big one. And now you can start building compliance audits with different intervals based off of the different types of devices in your network. Maybe things that are considered very, very critical or more important, you run more compliance audits on it. You repeat those daily or maybe a couple times a week versus other things that don't change as often, maybe once a month or once every 2 weeks. That's all definable to you in the same area in Operations Manager. Okay. In our third demonstration, let's take a look at that. This is a workflow I call test that an interface is online. So we want to publish this so that it can be used perhaps by your DevOps team as part of their CI/CD pipeline. And so they're going to have a series of tools that they use and platforms, and it's different for every ecosystem. It could be Git, it could be a number of other things. It could be GitHub, GitLab, or it could be homegrown. There's a lot of things out there, but one of the things that's pretty consistent is they need to be able to call a network automation, especially for things like testing, unit tests, functional tests, as well as provisioning network infrastructure. And so you can build workflows, and in fact, any kind of automation, whether it's testing. Maybe testing is the easiest way to get started, and that's what's going on here. In this case, let's say that in order for our CI/CD pipeline to be to provision some network infrastructure, it really needs to call some APIs that test that some criteria is correct or incorrect, so it knows whether or not to continue to provision the environment. This is in the world of network engineering. This is like a pre-check, right? And so in order to help the DevOps teams and to provide what they want, it really needs to come from the networking team because they have the experience and the knowledge of how to do it. We help them build automations quickly and simply like this so that they can quickly and simply be published and through an API and exposed to the DevOps team safely and securely. So what this does is the first step here is our transformation. This transformation takes input from, in one case, a form, in another case, from the API call. So the agent that's making the API call, whether that's a platform or a program or whatever it is, needs to feed some information, because if we're going to test if an interface is online, there's some data that we need to know. First of all, what's the device name? Second of all, what's the interface? And the other part that I've added to this is what's the IP address. So we want to make sure that the device is online, or that interface is online. So we need that information. So that information gets passed in, and I'll show you how that works. But the transformation extracts the data that we need to pass it to a command template. So we used a command template in the first demo. I'm using a command template here. I'll show you what the actual command template looks like. So this is the command template. We've done previous webinars on command templates, but one of the highlight of this is a network engineer that wants to automate a CLI managed network device can literally put in the commands that they would normally put in at the console and extract and test for the output. So if you look here, this is an iOS device. I want to show an interface, but I also have variabilized the name of the interface, because that's going to change depending on what we're fed in from the input. So we need to variabilize that. So I've created a variable called interface, and the output of this, the execution of this command, now gets tested against these rules. What I'm looking for is statically, is the interface is up and the line protocol is up. This is well known for all network engineers that have worked with Cisco. You're looking for both of those things to be up. The other thing we're looking at is, does the IP address exist on that interface? So the output of this should also give us a very specific IP address that we want to compare to. And of course, that's passed as a variable as well. And so the nice thing about command templates is I can go into here and test it on the fly. So if I can search the federated inventory. So if I look for iOS, I can choose an iOS device that's in the inventory. And then I can test this command. Even though it has variables, it's going to ask me to provide the variables. So for interface, I can say loop back 301. For IP address, I can say 1234. Submit. And now it's going to execute that, show us the output, and tell us, based off of these rules, whether it passed or failed. So the ultimate result was it failed, because both of these conditions were not met. You see here, the first condition was met, that this string did exist, and you can see it here, line loopback 301 is up, line protocol is up. However, the IP address that we fed it was 1.2.3.4 did not match, because the actual IP address is this. So we can test for the pass condition by doing this again, providing it the correct IP address. And that should retest everything and give us both pass conditions for here. And then our summary is passed. So this is how you build these templates. Here's how you call the template and automate it. This one task now references that template that I showed you, test interfaces online. We're passing the variables that it needs. So remember, the interface and the IP address, that's going to come from that transformation. It's going to extract that data out, as well as the device name. And then this query is the last bit. I just want to query. I want the results of the command template to see if, to look at the results itself, because this is what's going to give us the pass or fail. So what happens is, when this command template runs, it's going to extract a JSON. It's going to extract a bunch of data as output. It's going to be formatted as a JSON object. This query is going to extract the results from the JSON object and give us that value of pass or fail. And of course, you could start to build on your workflow here with more logic to do something on pass or fail. But for the sake of testing, we want to at least isolate the pass or the fail, so that it could be queried again when the workflow is run. Because remember, from a DevOps perspective, they just need to know if this test was successful or not. So we want to provide that data back to them when they query for the job after it's finished executing. So they'll execute the job through an API call, and then they can follow up, because once the job finishes, they can look at the value. So that's what this query is for. So again, how do we publish this? We do the same thing. We create a new automation to publish in Operations Manager. I'm going to call this webinar Test Interfaces Online. I'm going to create that. And then, of course, we've got to reference the workflow. So test interfaces online. That's the name of the workflow that we just walked through. I can create a trigger here. And now this is a type API. So I'm going to give it the name API, and I'm going to select type API trigger. So now we're given a couple of more pieces of information to fill out here. Because this is an API, it's going to ask us for an endpoint. So this is the URL that some external tool, platform, program will access with the right authorization credentials and be able to run this automation via this API. So I'm going to call this test interface, just like that. We also can optionally define another transformation so that the data that's passed to this particular workflow from that external platform source, whatever the DevOps teams is using, they're going to pass data to us. Because remember, we do need a name of a device, the interface, and the IP address that it should be tested against. So we can do that here. We can create a transformation to extract that. But we also have a way to validate that data even before the automation executes through an API. And again, these are things that have to be created and built. They don't come for free when you're building, command line based scripting. So all of this comes with the platform. We try to make it very easy to publish this, but this is a way to define now a JSON object, or I'm sorry, a JSON schema, to define the values that get passed to it from this API, from that API, the agent on the other side of the API call, making the call in. So we can validate the input. I'm going to leave this general because this is a general schema here, but you would definitely want to lock that down and only accept values that are necessary to run the flow. And again, this is a form of validation before any execution takes place. So if I save changes here, now I have an API trigger that's available, so I could run this externally. But we also can do something like this too. I can take the same workflow. So remember, self-service, this is self-service to DevOps teams or other teams that may need to do some testing or even provisioning infrastructure through an API call. But I can take the same workflow here and create a second manual trigger and make this available as long as I have a form that matches, and I do. So it's very flexible. I can run this manually now, or I can run it from an API call. And maybe this is another form of testing, right? I can say, hey, let's run this manually. So if I run this, now I have access to run this manually from this form. And we can see the thing execute from here. And then we can take a look at our query, and we can say, here was the result. Here was the outgoing. So the result from the query is it queried the data that came from here, and it said the result data was true, which means it passed, which then becomes a value that is passed on externally that can be tested by a second API call that's looking at this job. I can say, aha, the final value is that thing is online, true or false. It's true, so it's online, so it passed that particular test. So that's manually. So now, if I'm done testing that manually, I can disable that and say, okay, now let's test it through an API. So how do we do that? Well, you could test it through Postman. Through Postman, I've set this up so that I can log in with my credentials. I get my token. And so now I have the right authentication token. So notice here, first thing here is this URL. This is the URL that we defined as an endpoint when I created the API trigger method. Test interface is the endpoint. And so I've defined it here with the URL. So this is the API call that we just created. And now I'm using Postman to pass a JSON object of form data. So this is the data that needs to get passed in order to run the test. So this defines the router, the interface, and the IP address that we want to test against. And so if I send this out, it's going to run it. We get the message back that it's okay. The DevOps team can also capture this ID, which allows them to make another call back into the system to determine the status, if it's finished, and then what the ultimate status of that test was. And in this case, because we're an operations manager, we also can take a look at jobs that have run. and we'll take a look at all of the jobs here. And the top job should be the one we've just created. So remember, the first time we ran this test interfaces online, we did it manually. Here's the test interfaces online through an API trigger. So this is the one that we just created through and published and then ran through the API call through Postman. And here we can again take a look at this query, look at the outgoing results that pass true. So that means the route of the interface and the IP address was passed to this command template. It passed those conditions through. The query says it's true. And then the end result is I'm passing that as a value that can be also tested globally, is online true. And that gives the the DevOps team a way to test that it interfaces online. Again, this is an example. What are the kind of functional and unit tests that they need? This could be a lot more complex, right? You could, if you're looking at a service, maybe you test every feature that creates that service. That could be multiple devices. It could be VLANs, IP addresses, things like that. You can also do functional tests that identify connectivity end to end. All of the things are available, and you can build in Automation Studio in our platform, and then very quickly and easily publish them through Operations Manager and make it easy and simple for self-service for DevOps teams. And then finally, the last one we'll look at here is kind of the bigger thing that a lot of IT organizations are looking at is, we're using applications specifically like ServiceNow, but there could be other platforms as well that have capabilities to build self-service portals or catalogs, things of that nature. How can you integrate with those, integrate network automations to do things like provision infrastructure, right? Or provision a service to an end user. So not just your networking team, not just the DevOps team as part of, integrating with their pipeline and their work, but offering network, services to your end user, whether that's somebody within IT or even an end customer. So obviously you're going to build very, very comprehensive workflows for this with things like lots of pre-check processes, post-check processes, lots of logic to understand if things have passed, if things have failed. This is a simplified version just for demonstration. Obviously you can get as complex as you want, but the idea remains is, how do you now automate the creation of services and then publish those into a bigger platform like ServiceNow? So I'll show you that here. So what this does is it creates a new interface, maybe the simplest of services, obviously, but the idea is the same. Whatever your service looks like, you can automate every piece of creating that service within an automated workflow. So the first thing here is, well, if we're going to create a new interface, we probably need some data. In this case, we need data about like what device, what's the interface name, IP address, description, net mask. So that's what this does. This transformation is going to take that data from a form or wherever it comes from, originates from a form, from a user perhaps. It's going to extract the data so it can be used in further tasks. So in this case, the data that gets transformed here is going to be used in this particular task here. So you would have, I've stubbed out just kind of as a placeholder pre-check processes. So you want to make sure you do some sanity checking. So perhaps making sure the IP addresses are correct, making sure the device is correct, whatever that pre-check process needs to be before you actually make a change. But once your pre-check process is complete and you're satisfied that all that data looks good and information is ready to be turned into configurations, then you can actually start to configure network devices. And in this case, it's interesting is we're actually using a Python script. So earlier I talked about if you're writing network automations in Python, that's great. But if you want to expose these, how are you going to do that, right? What are the libraries are you going to use in your Python script to make this API accessible? Do you have to build Flask into it and make it API accessible as a standalone thing? Or do you have to start building a platform where you can onboard all your scripts and then make them API accessible? How do you integrate with your LDAP system? How do you allow access, read, write access from different groups, different users, those kind of things? How do you audit? How do you ensure that jobs are completed or any errors? All of those things come with our platform. But all of those things need to be built if you're going down the route of leveraging the scripting for network automations. And the beautiful thing about this is, yes, it's all in our platform, but we can still leverage your scripts. So you can build awesome Python scripts. In this case, it's a simple one that we pulled from Cisco DevNet to create an interface and uses NetMiko. We can leverage those scripts as is without having to worry about any of that stuff that doesn't come for free that somebody has to build or solve for. And that's what this is showing here is even when you've got a tremendous amount of assets already built, pop them into our system. We use Automation Gateway as a part of our platform that can onboard all your standalone scripts and then make them available as tasks, just like any other API call to any other system. So we do all of that for you in rapid and security, encryption, authentication, all of that. So in this case, we're passing data into the script. It needs the name of the router. It needs an interface, a description, an IP, and a net mask. And so we're feeding that from our source. And then we could do a bunch of post-check processes. And if we're happy, everything's hunky-dory and the provisioning is done. So now let's take that and let's move over to Operations Manager. Again, I'm going to create a new published automation here, and we're going to call this Create New Interface. The workflow obviously is going to reference what we just saw. New interface. You need the trigger. So let's define our trigger here. And I'm going to define this as manual. I'll explain why in a minute. And now it's asking us for a form, and obviously we have a form associated with this. This was created called Create, same name, Create New Interface. And this is what the form looks like. I'll show it to you here. So I could manually run this, and it's asking us what's the router name, what's the interface name, IP address, net mask, and then a description. And if I run this manually, it's going to go through that workflow. But within our platform, we actually, because exposing and publishing and doing self-service is such a critical part of what we've built and engineered for, we also want to make it super simple to integrate into other larger platforms. So I spoke about ServiceNow. So if I go into our ServiceNow instance here that we use for demonstrations, we have started and will continue to do this for ServiceNow as our first version of this, as we've custom built and have certified a ServiceNow application that lives in the ServiceNow App Store. And it exists so that networking teams can work with a ServiceNow admin, not a ServiceNow developer or group of developers, just with the admin. And within, 10, 15 minutes, they download the application from the certified application from the ServiceNow App Store, just like they've probably already done with a number of other applications. They download that, install it, do some brief configuration. That configuration essentially identifies the instance of the Itential platform that you want to call automations from, along with authentication information, username, password, tokens. And once that's done, ServiceNow, our application removes the need to do any kind of custom development work, which makes both the networking team and the ServiceNow team really happy, because a lot of times integrating not just our platform, but anybody's platform or scripts in order to do network automation requires a lot of custom programming, and not just a one-time kind of custom programming, but anything like when a form changes or you're asking for more details for a particular automation. And a form changes, well, that would facilitate somebody making a change, not only in the network automation, but then the form within ServiceNow itself. So with this application, we essentially say, once you've installed this, we will do things dynamically. So that kind of custom code isn't necessary. And the ServiceNow development team can continue to focus on writing things in ServiceNow that are absolutely important and needed, while networking teams can now work with ServiceNow admins to start exposing automations into the platform for end users. So this is kind of like, how do we expand this to like an even bigger group to be used? And what we found is, as we've helped customers expose like network provision network services, even for things like, updating load balancers or updating DNS, things like that. Obviously, once they built the automation and exposed them, they find that like this gets used all the time. And so the utilization goes up. So you're increasing adoption. So now that I've created that, this is why that manual trigger is working with the ServiceNow app, and I don't have to publish it as an API. I don't have to define an endpoint. It's working through the ServiceNow app. We will have more apps to come, for sure, coming soon with other platforms to make it easier to integrate with that whatever platform, in this case ServiceNow, along with the Itential automation platform, and make it frictionless and super simple for both teams to coexist and work together for the benefit of all of IT. So now I will go here and I will pick the SE Lab. This is the on-prem IAP that I'm currently using and working on here. And now it's going to go through an authentication process initially as it connects to the instance. And then once that's done, we will be able to dynamically see all of the automations that have been published that I have access to. And because I have access to basically all the automations, they'll all be there. But again, you can create groups and organizational hierarchies and groups so that only certain automations exist for certain. Now you'll see that it's connected to the Itential platform that we've been using for this demo. And now it does a dynamic API call to get all of the automations that have been published. And of course, the one we're looking for here is create new interface. So once it's done that, it immediately understands that we've defined this as a manual trigger. And because the manual trigger allows us to specify a form, this is why we're using the manual trigger. It specifies a form. And this is critical because the ServiceNow app that we've published now allows us to grab the form and then render it in ServiceNow. So the form that's created in Itential is pulled up in real time as needed to a user who now wants to run this automation to create a new interface so that there's self-service network provisioning. And that form, as it was created or as it's modified and updated, gets pulled in dynamically at runtime. And so now that makes it very simple for networking teams to continue to iterate and build better and better automations without having to worry about making sure the ServiceNow code is updated to support the latest version of like a form perhaps, which could change all the time. So in this case, it's also pulling up the default values that we've defined in the form so that when I run this automation, it's going to tell me, okay, it's run. You want to take a look at the job details. And since I have access to the platform, I can take a look at the job running. And it's gone through the pre-check process. It's configured the network interface. We could take a look at any of these values here. So we're back in Operations Manager. We can take a look at the outgoing. So all that data was fed into it from our form in ServiceNow, extracted through this transformation. Pre-check processes was just a holder, but it's complete for sake of demonstration. Now we're actually making the network change. And if we look here, you can see that the ultimate status, this is the response we're querying for, was success. So this query task right here is querying this data. And so it returns this value success. The post-check process is complete. And then I've also created a variable also, so it could be used in another way. If we wanted to do an API call, it could be used that way as well. And its value is success. And so with that, let me go back here to my last slide. I want to thank you. Hopefully this was very helpful so that you could see that with Itential, we allow you to start with self-service, perhaps with your team, provisioning or providing automations that are useful for day-to-day tasks, but you can quickly grow beyond that to start integrating your automations with other IT teams, so colleagues in DevOps who might want your assistance so you can have a seat at the table and they can say, hey, can you provide us automations that are available through APIs so that we can, do testing, provision, infrastructure as part of a CI/CD pipeline. And then finally, being able to expose these automations, especially for provisioning network services, into other platforms like ServiceNow using an application and how we simplify that and can extract those forms so that they can be rendered within that other platform in real time. So hopefully this was useful. Thank you very much again. And we look forward to seeing you on our next webinar. Bye-bye.